Everywhere you go, everywhere you look, they tell you the same thing. If you got a turbo LS, you got to change the cam. What about a guy that wants to run a turbo with a stock cam? So why combine a turbo with a stock cam? Well, there are a lot of guys out there that like the idle quality, the drivability, and the fuel mileage of a stock cam. They like what a stock cam does. They just want more power. So they want all the stock stuff, they just want more of it, and that's exactly what a turbo does. A turbo just makes the motor think it's bigger. Whatever's there, there's more of it now. So it's a perfect combination for a lot of guys. So in this video, I'm going to show you 3 different LS combinations: a 4.8, a 5.3, and a 6.2, all with a stock cam and all with boost. To start, our salute to the guys that are keeping their stock cams in their turbo LS motors. And I get a lot of these questions. Well, what if I don't want to change the cam? What if I want to stay with the stock cam? What if I want all the drivability and stuff? And all I want really is just more power, but with the stock stuff. And so I've run a lot of tests with stock cams and turbos, because that's usually our baseline. So we start with a stock cam, then we do a cam upgrade, and I show you how wonderful putting a cam in an LS is, especially on a turbo application, because we always pick up big power. But that doesn't stop the guys from wanting to run basically stock cams, because the nice thing about a stock cam is it runs like a stock cam. It does all the things that GM designed it to do in the stock application. And this is really important on some of the smaller motors like the 4.8 liter, because you want it to behave and do everything that it's supposed to do. You just want a little more power, and that's the nice thing about having a turbo. You can add that turbo to any camshaft, including the stock cam, because yes, the stock cam is also a turbo cam. So I want to show all the stock guys what happens. So I got 3 different combinations. The first one is a 4.8 liter, and the only thing different about this particular one is that long ago it had been hurt, so I put forged pistons in it, but it had stock rods and stock block and crank and stuff, and everything else was stock on it, stock heads and stock intake manifold and stuff. So what we did was run it with a stock cam, and we ran long tube headers. I ran it up on the dyno at West-Tech like we normally do. We ran it with a Holley HP management system, and it had long tube, like the inexpensive DNA headers that I used in the low buck header test. So if you take a look at that, video is right up here. Check out the header test. The low buck stuff was always really popular, but those headers actually worked very well. They were stainless, and they even had smaller collectors and stuff, and they actually performed fairly well. But our 4.8 liter run with a stock cam NA and those headers, and obviously tuned up with the HP management system, made 338.5, so 339 horsepower, and 342 foot-pounds of torque. So now let's see what happened when we ran the single turbo on it. And we ran it with the stock exhaust manifolds feeding a Y pipe, and then a single DNA turbo, the GT45 basically turbo, which is sized fine for this 4.8 liter. Really, for a 4.8 with a stock cam, I might pick something that was a little bit more responsive. And I know in the last video I told you guys to pick a big cam that was bigger than you wanted to have, and that's what this DNA is. But if you're really only running a stock cam and you're running a low boost, there's probably better turbos that might be a little bit more responsive than this thing. But we did run that turbo with a air to water intercooler on it. So let's take a look and see what we ran here, and I'll go ahead and show you the boost curve right after this so you can see. But the important thing about this curve is that it's doing what the factory curve does, what the factory NA curve does, because all we did was add boost to this. The boost doesn't really change the shape of the curve unless you don't have a consistent boost curve. So if we had a rising boost curve like a centrifugal, which again is another video I'm going to show you, I want to show you what the difference between a turbo combination and a centrifugal supercharger is, because I always tell you that boost just adds to what is there, but a centrifugal blower actually changes what's there. So I'm going to do a video on that and kind of show you the difference. This is pretty cool stuff. So anyway, on our 4.8 liter, we added a single turbo and tuned it, and it all ran perfect. And if you look at the shapes of the curve, it's kind of still making power at the same spot. The curve is falling, the power curve is falling away at higher RPM because there's not enough camshaft there. You've added a ton of torque in the middle, which is kind of right where you want it. It still had a bunch of extra torque even down low, down at 3,000 RPM. So it did all the good things. It is exactly what a guy that has a stock camshaft in an LS wants. It is the stock motor, but just a lot more powerful. So this thing made 524 horsepower and a kind of nearly matching 529 foot-pounds of torque. So let's look at the boost curve on this one, and then we'll step up to our larger 5.3 liter. Here is the boost curve produced by that DNA GT45 turbo on our 4.8 liter, or basically stock 4.8 liter with the forged pistons. And the first thing you'll notice is, hey, Richard, what's going on? That's a rising boost curve. That's not perfectly flat like it's supposed to be. Well, part of what you're seeing is the scale. I mean, that's 6.5 and 7.75. So that's a total difference of 1.25 pounds. And while that's not a lot, it's not perfectly flat, and part of that, I think, is, like I said, I think that the GT45 is probably not ideal for the 4.8 liters, especially a stock one. I think you could put a slightly smaller turbo or a better responsive turbo on there and have this thing be perfectly flat if that's what you wanted. Honestly, it's making over 6 pounds even at 3,000 RPM, so that's actually fairly good. But here's the boost curve. And like again, I said before, I'm going to do a video on a real rising boost curve like it's a centrifugal and show you what effect that has on the power curve compared to a turbo. But this is a relatively flat curve. I did a manual boost controller on this. As a matter of fact, I think we may have had it hooked up, but not even had it adjusted. So basically we were just running on the spring, and this is what it produced. So this is our curve. Now let's take a look at a larger 5.3 liter with a stock cam and see how well that thing worked out. The 5.3 liter test motor run with the stock cam for this test was actually not a stock 5.3 liter, although it wasn't far off. It was a test motor belonging to David Freiberg. He loaned me for the test, and it featured forged internals from I think from the guys at Summit. I could be wrong about that, but it did have forged internals, but the forged piston was a dish piston, so it was like a 10cc dish piston, so it had lower compression than factory. It had a factory 862 heads on it. They did have springs in it because we were going to be running a camshaft, but it had the factory LM7 cam and a stock truck intake and throttle body, and it did have long tube headers, kind of just like we ran with the 4.8 liter, but these were 1 3/4 headers. So run with the stock cam and NA trim, the slightly lower compression 5.3 liter, produced 332 horsepower. So kind of on par with that, with the smaller 4.8 liter, although at a different RPM, this thing made much more torque. It produced 360 foot-pounds of torque. So here's what happened after we installed the single turbo setup. When we first ran it at 9.6 pounds, and I'll show you the boost curves just like we did with the 4.8 liter. And as you can see, like we did with the 4.8 liter, the shapes of the curves are very similar, just kind of elevated everything. So it's like a stock motor. It's just like a much bigger stock motor. So instead of 332 or 3 or 4 or 5 horsepower, it's now making 532 horsepower. So everybody wants an extra 200 horsepower. And because all of this is happening so low, there's also lots and lots of torque. 555 foot-pounds of torque. And even down here, you see down here near 3,000 RPM, it had 440 foot-pounds. So it was making good power and good torque. And it's exactly what a guy wants that wants to run with the stock cam. He basically just wants more of everything. And that's the nice thing about boost. But we didn't. We actually ran a little bit higher boost. We were trying to match the boost pressure for another run on this thing, so we turned it up just a smidge. We turned it up to like 10.5 pounds, and since we turned it up about a pound, you can see that it just made another pound of boost everywhere. The shape of the curve was the same, and it kind of mirrors the factory curve. More boost just added more everywhere because we added a consistent amount. So this should give you a pretty good indication on what boost does to the power curve. It's the same power curve, the same shape. So for all the guys out there that want to know what their motor does, or some other motor that you're asking me to do a video on, what it does under boost, if you take a look at an NA power curve, it's just that. So effectively all you have to do is go over here to the side and change the numbers over here, and that's what your curve looks like. It just looks like that under boost. So now let's check out and see what these boost curves look like on this 5.3 liter. The interesting thing about this one on this 5.3 liter, because we were going to be modifying it and running lots of power and lots of boost, we had a fairly good sized turbo on here. We had an S480 billet wheel from the guys at LJMS. And this turbo is certainly a 1,000+ horsepower turbo, and we ran it with this low compression 5.3 liter with a stock cam. So predictably, it had, you know, a not terribly responsive boost curve down low, because it wasn't designed to really be running in this kind of power level. It was designed to be running at twice this power level, basically. So it was softer down low. It was only down around 4.7 pounds of boost down here when we're loading it at about 3,000 RPM. And then it finally comes up and levels off about 9.5 pounds. So, you know, an S480 for this kind of application obviously isn't ideal. You'd step way down in turbo size, something more like that GT45, although a better version of that. There are much better versions of that. They're obviously going to be more money, but you'd have a better version of that you could run at this kind of power level. But here's what happened when we stepped up in boost to 10.5 pounds. You can see we raised the boost by 1 pound basically, and just like with our our previous deal, when I was showing you the power curves, it just elevates the boost curve, and when you elevate it by that amount, you elevate the power by that amount. The shape stays the same. Everything is kind of the same. So we just put, basically 1 more pound of boost, and it picked up that amount of power. Did exactly what it's supposed to on a turbo. Again, that sort of rising curve is a function of the size of the turbo relative to the power output of the motor. There would be a better choice at this power level and boost level. So now let's take a look at the bigger 6.2 liter and see how things worked out there. Our last stock cam test motor was actually the largest. It was a 6.2 liter LS3, and this was a factory GM crate motor, which always works very well. It's really nice to have a nice, shiny, fancy new motor every once in a while to kind of take the place of all the ratty stuff that comes from the wrecking yard that you have to clean up and sweep and use gasoline to clean and all that stuff. But, the crate motor stuff works out really well, and it's a fixed thing. But the interesting thing about this test is not so much that we had a shiny, fancy new crate motor, but that we ran it with an old management system. I don't even think that they sell it anymore, but it was called, it was an MSD, it was called the Wired Less. And everyone when they first introduced this, I remember being at SEMA, somebody came over to me and said, "Hey, these guys have a wireless EFI setup." I'm like, wow, are they using transmitters or something? What are they doing? And I walked over, and it's not wireless, it's wired less, meaning that there was less wire associated with doing, or that it was all hidden, basically. And they did a good job with it, but the interesting thing about it is that it would do closed loop. So basically the idea was that you could hook it up and plug in a few bits of information, and then it would run on the O2 sensor, and it would adjust the desired air fuel based on closed loop operation, which was kind of cool. And then it would provide a kind of a fixed safe timing level, which we then had to adjust because we actually had to add more timing when we first did it, because it was not hardly making any power, which was good, and I wanted to be safe. And I remember how scared I was letting it just do its job, and me just like being on the stick and going to wide open throttle and hoping that it would do what it was supposed to do. Now we could pull off the throttle and kind of abort the run if we had to, but still it's a lot more nerve-wracking than knowing that I had already put the right air fuel in there and the right timing, and that it was exactly the way that it was supposed to be on every run. So this was kind of cool, but it had it was the factory LS3, and with the factory LS3 cam, this one had long tube headers, and it was doing self-tuning with that MSD wireless deal. And it actually made a little bit less power because it was a little bit more conservative than the way that we run it. So it made 482 horsepower and 483 foot-pounds of torque, which is kind of square, which is what we typically see. We normally see a little bit more horsepower than torque on an LS3. And again, the reason this number is higher than the 430 horsepower rated is just the way that we test it. Watch some of the other videos. There's a full explanation on why this number is higher. It's not a happy dyno thing. It's just the way that we test it without any accessories, and it's cold and headers and all that. So here's what happened when we put our single turbo on. And this one was actually the smallest of the turbos on our biggest motor. It was one of the 76 millimeter CX Racing turbos, and I did that so because I didn't want this thing self-tuning its way to doing all of what the turbo would do. So we put a light spring in the wastegate, and then we put this small turbo on there, and then I'll show you the boost curve obviously after I show you the kind of power here. So here's what happened when we installed our turbo. And as we see, it's got a similar torque shape and a similar horsepower curve shape. And part of the reason that it's not exact like the other ones is because we had a changing boost curve. We had actually had a falling boost curve for two reasons. One, back pressure starting to get high on this LS3 application because it's a fairly powerful application that's a fairly small turbo, and we were just using a manual wastegate controller. So it had a lot of things going against it that caused the boost curve to change. But when it's not, when it's fixed, you see that there's really no change in the curve when everything is right. So we went from 480 horsepower up to 644 horsepower. Torque was up quite a bit, 675, and that's because the boost was higher where the torque peak was than it is where the horsepower peak was. But again, since this thing was self-tuning, I was just happy that it worked and we could make full throttle runs and that it didn't blow up. So now let's take a look at the boost curves and we can explain a little bit of what's going on there. So here's the reason that the boosted power curve didn't exactly mirror the NA power curve. It's because we didn't really have a flat boost curve. And the combination of a small turbo, back pressure, the use of a manual wastegate controller, an oversized engine for the size of the turbo, all combined to produce basically a falling boost curve. So we started out as high as, we were in the 7 to 7.5 pound range, and out at the power peak, basically out near 6,000 RPM, we had dropped down below 5.5 pounds of boost. So a falling boost curve tends to flatten out the horsepower curve. It's not a good combination. We see lots of torque and then the horsepower goes away. If the boost curve is flat or relatively flat, we just mirror the shape of the power that's there. So that's why, stock cams work really well. So all you stock cam guys, make sure you size the turbo right for your combination. Make sure you have good boost control and you can have a nice flat boost curve, and you'll make plenty of power. You'll have all the drivability. The car will basically run and drive like it does when in stock with the stock cam. It's just when the boost comes on, when you get in the throttle and need more power, you'll have a lot more power there. That's the benefit of adding a turbo to a stock cam. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay guys, what'd you think about our test? What'd you think about combining a stock cam with boost? Personally, I think it's a good combination for a lot of guys. Like, I'd like to have that in my truck if my transmission would take that, but it probably won't. But the stock cam does a lot of good stuff. It does all the things that the stock cam was designed to do. And when you add boost to it, it just makes more of everything. So if you're not looking for 1,000,000 horsepower, that's a good combination. I mean, you can add 100, 200, or even 300 horsepower, whatever you want to add with the turbo, how much ever boost you want to run, especially if you ran E85 on it, it would be pretty cool. But a lot of guys are using that kind of combination for things like towing and stuff, and it works well. And it's a lot of fun because when you add a couple extra 100 horsepower, it's really noticeable. So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Every LS, you got to put a cam in it, especially a turbo one, because it's going to make more power and it's going to do it at a lower boost level and all that stuff. Or do you guys like the idea of a stock cam, stock motor with boost? Let me know in the comments, guys. Thanks for watching. I'm Richard Holder. Like, share, subscribe, all those things. Thanks for watching, guys.